In a dusty, remote town in New Mexico called Rio Verde, a quiet, unassuming girl named Sofia and her loyal dog, Max, live a peaceful life. Little do the ruthless Mexican cartel know that when they kidnap Sofia to force her family into a dangerous deal, they've crossed paths with an unexpected adversary. Max, a retired military dog trained in combat, has been quietly watching over Sofia all these years. What follows will lead to a deadly confrontation that not only threatens to bring down the cartel, but shatter their criminal empire in ways they never expected. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because tomorrow we have special story for you. Rio Verde was the kind of town most people would overlook. The only thing that made it stand out was the faded wooden sign at the town's entrance, swaying gently in the wind. Welcome to Rio Verde, Pop 476. The land around it stretched far and wide, flat for miles, the sun casting an endless heat over the rolling desert landscape. It was a place where the desert and sky met, a town wedged between the mountains, tucked away from the chaos of the world beyond. Life here was simple, quiet, peaceful. Sofia Garcia lived in this town, a 10-year-old with an adventurous spirit and a heart full of dreams bigger than the desert itself. Her life was ordinary, until that fateful day when the cartel set their eyes on her family. And on that day, nothing would ever be the same. Max, the German shepherd who had been with Sofia since she was 5, was her protector, her constant companion. He was no ordinary dog. Max was a retired military working dog, silent, disciplined, and fiercely loyal. His training ran deeper than the bond they shared, and every instinct in his body screamed at him to guard Sofia, even when she didn't realize she needed guarding. Sofia didn't know much about her father's past, the work he did in the city before settling in Rio Verde. She only knew that he kept a quiet, protective eye on the family. But one evening, that silence shattered. A white van, unfamiliar and ominous, rolled into the dusty streets of the town. Max's ears perked up as he lay beside Sofia, who was playing in the backyard with a few of the neighborhood kids. His instincts, honed through years of service, were now on high alert. Something was wrong. He growled low, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the van as it parked in front of their house. Sofia didn't notice the van immediately. She was busy with her friends, laughing as they ran around the small yard, the distant mountains casting a long shadow over the playground of their childhood. But Max knew. He always knew when danger was near. It wasn't until a shadow cast over her that Sofia turned and saw the 3 men, wearing dark clothes and serious expressions, standing at the edge of her yard. Her heart skipped a beat. The air grew thick, heavy, suffocating. Max's growl turned into a vicious bark, and he lunged toward the men, his hackles raised, ready to defend his family. "Get inside, Sofia!" her mother shouted from the house. But it was too late. The men were fast, much faster than Sofia could process. They grabbed her, one of them slipping a cloth over her mouth, causing her to gasp for air. Max, too late, lunged at one of the men, but a heavy boot kicked him back, knocking him into the dirt. He growled, snarling, but Sofia was already in the hands of the men who had come to take her. The white van's door slammed shut, and it sped off, tearing away from the house with a roar of the engine, leaving nothing but the dust hanging in the air. The peaceful town of Rio Verde, which had known only the sound of wind and occasional car tires on its long roads, now felt like it was holding its breath. Inside, Sofia's mother ran out the back door, calling for help, but Max, though still recovering from the brutal shove, was already sprinting after the van. His training was clear now. He knew what was at stake. His mission had changed. No longer just a dog protecting a little girl, but now the protector of a kidnapped child who held the key to destroying the very empire that had come for her. The cartel had made a grave mistake. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. Max was faster than most dogs, but this was no ordinary chase. The van carrying Sofia was speeding down the dirt road, kicking up clouds of dust as it rumbled through the quiet desert. His instincts told him to push harder, to run faster, but every part of him knew that this was a race against time. The men inside the van had taken Sofia with one goal in mind: leverage. They had no idea what they were up against. Max's paws hit the ground with precision, his muscles working like a finely tuned machine. The years of training in military operations had shaped him into something more than a pet. He wasn't just chasing the van. He was calculating, planning his next move. He could smell the exhaust of the van, the scent of the men who dared to take Sofia. But there was something more, an overwhelming, undeniable sense of urgency. He had to get her back. Sofia's cries echoed in Max's ears, even though she was miles away. He could sense her panic, her confusion, and above all, the fear that now clouded her world. His heart beat in time with his paws hitting the dry earth. She was out there, scared, and they had no idea what was coming. Back at the house, Sofia's mother, Maria, stood at the edge of their yard, her hands shaking as she called for help. Her voice trembled with fear, but it was Max's loyalty that had always steadied her. Now, with Sofia gone, her eyes searched the horizon for a glimpse of the dog that had always kept them safe. But all she saw was the van disappearing into the distance. Max had never been this far from home, and the road ahead seemed endless. The landscape in front of him was a sea of dull browns and faded greens. He knew the terrain well. This was his playground when he wasn't on duty. The mountains in the distance were familiar to him, the dry brush along the sides of the road a comforting sight. But now, they were barriers. Every inch of ground was a challenge, a race to catch up with the people who had dared to take the one person he was sworn to protect. As he continued the chase, the realization hit him. The van wasn't slowing down. The cartel was trying to lose him, but Max wasn't going to stop. He couldn't. He had to reach Sofia before they did something even worse than kidnapping her. He knew too well how ruthless they could be. Inside the van, Sofia was scared and confused, her mind racing as she struggled against the bonds that held her. Her small frame was tied to one of the seats, and a cloth still hung loosely over her mouth, preventing her from shouting for help. But even with the cloth, she knew she had to stay quiet. She had no idea who these men were or what they wanted, but her mind kept racing to one thing: Max. He would come for her. She was sure of it. Max had always protected her, always watched over her. But what if he couldn't catch up? What if they were too far gone by the time he realized where they were headed? The van swerved sharply, cutting across the uneven desert road, its tires kicking up a trail of dust behind it. Sofia's stomach lurched as they sped toward an unknown destination. She could see the men's faces in the rearview mirror, hard, emotionless, but focused. They were after something bigger than just a ransom. Her father's old connections were more than enough to get them what they needed, Sofia realized. But what could they want with her? A girl her age, alone in the world? She tried to keep her thoughts focused, tried to think of a way out, but the fear was clouding everything. Max's heart was racing too, but it was his training that kept him focused. The van was still within his reach. The men may have thought they could outrun him, but they underestimated the bond between a dog and his person. Sofia was his responsibility, and that was a bond no one could break. The distance between them shrank with every second, Max pushing his body to its limits. He could see the van now, a dark figure ahead on the dirt road. His muscles burned, his breath ragged, but he pressed forward. His mind was single-minded, focusing only on one thing: Sofia. His eyes narrowed as he spotted the van slowing down just ahead, making a turn onto a more secluded, less traveled path. The trees in the distance offered some cover, but Max knew it would be a dangerous move to follow them directly. The cartel had likely anticipated someone following them. They might be waiting in ambush. He couldn't let them get ahead. Not now. Max increased his speed, pushing harder than ever before. He knew the road they were taking. It led to an old, abandoned farmhouse, a perfect spot for hiding. It had been a long time since anyone had used it, but the cartel might know of it too. That's when the decision hit him. He had to lead them away from the farmhouse. He couldn't risk it. He made a quick turn off the path, knowing that he would have to circle around and catch them off guard. He had to be quick. He had to be smart. Back at the farmhouse, the cartel men had already begun setting up. They had no idea that Max was closing in. They were confident in their plan. They would hold Sofia for ransom, use her to force her father's cooperation. But none of them realized that the biggest threat wasn't the girl. They hadn't even considered the dog. Max was already in position. He had made his way to a hill overlooking the farmhouse. His eyes locked onto the target, the van parked in the yard, the men still preparing inside. He was ready. The time to strike was coming. With a deep breath, Max took his first step forward, and the sound of his paws hitting the earth was the only warning the cartel had before everything changed. The cool desert air felt like ice against Max's fur as he crouched low behind the rocks, his body completely still. His trained eyes were locked onto the farmhouse below, observing every detail of the scene. The van was parked a little further away from the building, and two of the cartel men were standing guard. Rifles slung over their shoulders, their attention momentarily diverted. Max's muscles tensed, ready to spring into action at the slightest signal. He had spent years being trained for moments like this. His mission had always been simple: protect, serve, neutralize. But now, it was personal. Sofia was out there, trapped in a nightmare of violence and greed, and it was Max's job to tear that nightmare apart. He had been tracking them for miles, every step an agonizing test of his limits. His paws had left a trail of dust across the land, but he didn't care. All he cared about was getting Sofia back. He could hear her faint cries, feel her fear in his gut. She needed him. The men inside the farmhouse were unaware of the danger lurking just outside their doorstep. Max's keen ears picked up the faint sounds of their conversations, the clinking of metal as they moved about inside, preparing to set up camp. They thought they had control. They thought they had the upper hand. But Max knew better. This was his domain now. A faint breeze carried the scent of fresh earth and sweat toward him, and he didn't need to think twice. He slipped from his hiding place, moving silently across the terrain, his every step calculated. He was a shadow, blending seamlessly with the desert landscape, his body moving with precision. As he approached the guard nearest to the van, his instincts kicked in. The man was still distracted, looking toward the farmhouse, his hand resting lazily on the stock of his rifle. Max knew this was his chance. He crept forward, silent as a ghost, until he was just a few feet from the man. His target didn't hear him approach. Max was too skilled, too quiet. In one swift motion, Max lunged, his teeth sinking into the man's arm, knocking the rifle to the ground. The man screamed in pain, but Max was already on him, forcing him to the ground with a brutal efficiency that only a military dog could achieve. The other guard spun around, his eyes widening in shock at the sight of the massive dog overpowering his comrade. "Maldito perro!" The second man yelled, drawing his weapon and aiming at Max. Max didn't hesitate. He moved like lightning, dodging the bullet that whizzed by him, and with a well-placed strike, he knocked the second man's legs out from under him. The man fell with a grunt, his rifle flying from his hands as he hit the ground hard. Max was on him in an instant, pinning him down with his weight, his muzzle close to the man's throat. The cartel soldier struggled beneath him, but it was no use. Max had him. He had complete control of the situation. For a brief moment, the desert was still. The only sounds were the ragged breaths of the men beneath Max's paws and the distant wind rustling through the dry brush. And then, silence. Max shifted his focus, his ears flicking toward the farmhouse. His time was running out. The remaining cartel members inside would be alerted soon, and the longer he lingered, the more danger he put Sofia in. He couldn't afford to wait. He had to move. The men he'd taken down were still alive, but they were incapacitated, unable to fight back. Max glanced once more at the van, where Sofia was likely being held, and a primal growl rumbled deep in his chest. He could feel her fear as if it were his own. He moved swiftly back toward the farmhouse, his low growl alerting the remaining guards that something was wrong. Max didn't care. They would learn quickly that underestimating him was a fatal mistake. Inside the farmhouse, the cartel was beginning to panic. They'd heard the commotion outside, but they didn't yet know what was happening. They only knew that their plans were falling apart. Sofia's heart pounded in her chest. She had no idea what was going on, but she could hear the chaos outside. She knew Max was out there. She could feel it in her bones. Her only hope was that he would find a way to get her out. She was tied to a chair in a small room, her arms bound tightly behind her back. Her legs were sore from being held in one position for too long, but it was the fear that had her trembling. The fear of what might happen next. The men who had taken her were cold, ruthless, and they had made it clear that they would do anything to get what they wanted. But Sofia held on to one thing. She had Max, and as long as she had him, she had a fighting chance. Max's paws hit the dirt with determination as he approached the farmhouse's back door, his eyes scanning every possible escape route. He could hear the low murmur of voices inside. He didn't have much time before they realized what was happening. He crouched low, his eyes never leaving the door, waiting for the right moment. And then, in one fluid movement, he sprang into action. The door burst open, and Max was inside before anyone could react. He moved like lightning, his teeth flashing as he took down the first cartel member in his path. The man's cry of surprise was cut short as Max slammed him into the ground, pinning him with ease. Inside, the remaining cartel soldiers scrambled, fumbling for their weapons, but Max was too fast. He tore through the room, knocking them off balance, disarming them with a speed and precision that left them no chance. The farmhouse, once filled with the hum of control, was now chaos. Sofia's heart leaped in her chest when she heard the scuffle. She knew it. Max was there. He had come for her. With all the strength she could muster, she twisted in the chair, trying to free herself. The ropes cut into her skin, but she didn't care. She had to get to Max. The door burst open again, and there he was. Max stood in the doorway, his eyes locking onto hers, his body tense, ready to fight anyone who dared to stop him. "Max!" Sofia cried, her voice hoarse but filled with relief. Max moved toward her in an instant, his paws thudding against the wooden floor. He stopped in front of her, his nose nudging her face as he whined softly. The bond they shared was undeniable, and in that moment, Sofia knew she was going to be okay. Max was here, and together, they would bring down the cartel. Max quickly maneuvered around her, his teeth biting through the ropes that bound her to the chair. With a sharp tug, the ropes snapped, and Sofia was free. "Come on," she urged, her voice shaky with emotion. "We have to get out of here." Max growled softly, looking back toward the chaos, and then he bolted toward the door. He wasn't about to stop. The cartel was finished, and Max knew it. Together, they would bring their empire to its knees. Sofia's heart pounded as she sprinted after Max, her bare feet thumping against the wooden floor as they headed toward the back door of the farmhouse. The sound of Max's paws hitting the floor was like a drumbeat to her, steady, powerful, and unyielding. The chaos around them was still unfolding, but in that moment, it felt like she and Max were the eye of the storm, running through the madness with a single, unwavering purpose: survival. The moment Max freed her from the ropes, Sofia had been overwhelmed with a mix of fear, relief, and awe. She had always known that Max was special. After all, he was a retired military dog, but seeing him in action, taking down cartel members with the precision and skill of a seasoned fighter, filled her with a deep, undeniable sense of gratitude. Max was not just her protector. He was her guardian, her hero, and right now, he was her only hope. They burst out of the farmhouse and into the open air, the cool desert breeze carrying with it the scent of the mountains and the promise of escape. Sofia's breath was ragged as she ran beside Max, her body still recovering from the fear and stress of the past few hours. She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the area for any signs of pursuit. The men from the farmhouse would be after them. It was only a matter of time before they realized that their plans had been destroyed. But Max was already a few steps ahead. His body moved with the speed and grace of a predator, his focus unwavering as he led them through the underbrush toward a nearby ravine. The trees were dense here, providing cover from the open desert, and Sofia couldn't help but feel a small surge of hope. They were getting away. For now, the sound of pursuit was unmistakable. The crackle of voices, the distant hum of engines. It was all getting closer. Sofia's legs burned with exhaustion, but she pushed herself harder. She couldn't stop. Not yet. Not when they were so close to safety. Max turned back toward her, his body stiffening, and Sofia's breath caught in her throat. He was alert. He had sensed something. Sofia's gaze shot toward the ravine ahead, and for the briefest moment, She thought she saw movement in the shadows, a figure, perhaps one of the cartel men, hidden among the rocks. "Max," she shouted, her voice hoarse but urgent. "We need to move faster." Max's response was immediate. Without another second wasted, he surged forward, pulling Sofia with him, guiding her through the rugged terrain with a speed that left her breathless. They were nearing the ravine now, the steep drop just ahead, and Sofia's mind raced with thoughts of escape. They couldn't stop. They couldn't let the cartel catch up. The ground beneath them seemed to shift as they ran, the uneven terrain making every step a struggle. Sofia stumbled once, nearly falling, but Max was there to steady her, his strong body pushing her forward. She reached out to him instinctively, her hand grazing his fur, and in that moment, she realized how much she relied on him. Not just for protection, but for strength. Max was her anchor in this storm. "Hold on, Sofia," Max seemed to say with his every stride. They were nearly there. They reached the ravine's edge, and Max turned to look back at her. His eyes were sharp, his body poised for action, and Sofia knew that they were both ready for what came next. The cartel had no idea what they were facing. They would soon learn. Suddenly, the sound of gunfire rang out from behind them, sharp and sudden, like a crack of thunder in the otherwise silent desert night. Sofia's stomach dropped as she ducked instinctively, her heart racing as the bullets hit the ground near them. The pursuit had caught up faster than she expected. The cartel was relentless. But Max didn't flinch. He turned to Sofia, his eyes focused, and then back at the ravine. He knew the terrain, knew the path they needed to take. Without a moment's hesitation, he darted down the steep incline, forcing Sofia to follow as they descended into the darkened ravine below. The gunfire was still echoing behind them, but the rocks and brush gave them some cover. Max's body was like a shadow in the night, fluid and fast, his senses alert for any sign of danger. Sofia scrambled after him, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. They had to get away. They had to make it to the other side of the ravine. The cartel was closing in, and they couldn't afford to be caught. Max led her around sharp rocks and through narrow pathways, moving with the precision of a soldier in battle. The further they went, the more the sounds of pursuit seemed to fade, replaced by the quiet rustling of the wind through the desert brush. But Sofia knew better than to relax. They weren't out of danger yet. The ravine was deep, the walls of rock rising on either side like towering sentinels, but Max was leading them toward the bottom, where a creek ran through, its water glistening faintly in the dim light of the moon. If they could get to the creek, they could use the water to mask their tracks. The cartel would have no way of following them. Sofia's legs burned with fatigue as she stumbled to keep up, but Max was unwavering. He moved like the shadows, never once looking back to check on her. He was determined, focused, and it was that focus that kept Sofia going. She couldn't afford to give up now, not when she was so close. Ahead, the faint outline of the creek came into view, its water gleaming softly under the moonlight. The sound of rushing water was calming, a sharp contrast to the chaos that had consumed their world in the last few hours. But it wasn't safe yet. Max was the first to reach the creek, his body moving with ease into the water, his paws sinking into the cool, rushing stream. Sofia hesitated for only a moment before following, feeling the rush of the water as it swept past her ankles, guiding her deeper into the creek. The cartel would be looking for them. They would never stop. But in this moment, with Max by her side, Sofia realized that survival wasn't about running away. It was about fighting back. It was about doing whatever it took to make sure she never fell into the hands of people who wanted to take everything from her. And Max would make sure she never did. The cool water of the creek rushed past Sofia's legs, its flow strong enough to carry away the dust and sweat of their flight, but not strong enough to wash away the fear clawing at her chest. She could feel Max beside her, his pace never faltering, his eyes scanning every movement along the banks of the creek. The weight of the situation hadn't lightened. The sounds of pursuit were still distant, but not for long. The cartel was relentless, and the time to hide was running out. Sofia's breath hitched as she looked over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the dark canyon walls for any sign of movement. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale light over the landscape, but the shadows seemed to swallow everything that wasn't in direct view. Max moved with purpose, his body flowing through the creek like he was born to it, a silent predator in the night. Sofia could almost hear his thoughts, a silent promise that he would protect her no matter the cost. Ahead, the water grew deeper, the current faster. The creek led toward a narrow passage in the canyon walls, a natural culvert that twisted its way into the mountain beyond. Max had picked the path, and Sofia trusted him implicitly. The cartel would expect them to follow the creek for as long as it was visible, but Max was already thinking ahead. He would find another way. A distant shout echoed through the canyon, sending a jolt of terror through Sofia's heart. They were getting closer. The cartel was following them, and they weren't going to let up until they had Sofia. She had no idea why they wanted her. No clue what was so important that they would risk everything to capture her. But she knew one thing for sure. They wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. Max's low growl broke her thoughts as he glanced back toward her, his ears pinned flat against his head. He was sensing something, some movement just out of her sight. Without warning, he turned sharply to the right, leading Sofia away from the creek and into the shadows of the canyon wall. "Max?" Sofia whispered, the sound of her voice strange in the oppressive silence. Her heart was pounding, and every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, to escape, to hide. But she trusted Max, and if he was turning now, it was for a reason. The rocks around them grew steeper, the path narrower, as the moonlight filtered through the jagged walls above. Max moved silently, his form a shadow against the rocks. Sofia had to scramble to keep up, her breath quick and shallow, her mind racing with every step. Then she heard it, a faint rustling, barely perceptible over the sound of the creek, but unmistakable to someone who had learned to listen for danger. Sofia's pulse quickened. Max froze, his body rigid, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. His ears flicked toward the sound, and for a moment, Sofia wondered if it was the wind. But the movement was too deliberate. The cartel was close. Max dropped to the ground, his body pressing against the rocks as he crawled forward, inching along like a shadow. Sofia followed, her movements instinctive now. She didn't question his actions, didn't hesitate. She simply moved with him, every sense sharpened, every sound magnified. Ahead, a figure appeared, one of the cartel soldiers. He was walking along the creek, his flashlight sweeping in front of him as he searched for any sign of Sofia or Max. His boots crunched lightly against the gravel, his movements slow but deliberate, every step bringing him closer to the hidden trail Sofia and Max were following. Sofia held her breath, her heart hammering in her chest. Max's body was still as a statue beside her, his eyes locked on the soldier. He knew what needed to be done. He didn't need instructions. The cartel soldier stopped momentarily, looking down at the creek with suspicion. His flashlight flicked briefly in their direction, but Max, ever the expert, had them hidden just enough behind the rocks. The beam passed over them without a second glance. The soldier muttered something to himself, readjusting his rifle as he continued forward, unaware that death itself was crouching only a few feet away. Sofia exhaled in a slow, silent breath. Max didn't move. The danger had passed, for now, but it wouldn't last. They couldn't afford to be caught again. Max waited, his body coiled tight, every muscle ready to spring into action. Sofia slowly rose to her feet, moving as quietly as she could to follow him. They were deep enough into the canyon now, with the moon sinking low behind them, but there was still a long way to go before they reached the mountain's heart. And with every passing second, the cartel was getting closer. Their only hope was to stay one step ahead. Max led her deeper into the passage, navigating the rough terrain with an ease that Sofia could only admire. His movements were precise, every step taken with intention, every glance searching for the next sign of danger. They moved through narrow corridors between massive rocks, and Sofia felt the weight of the chase on her shoulders. It was no longer just about running. It was about surviving. Max was always a step ahead, and though Sofia couldn't see the path he had in mind, she trusted him implicitly. But even Max, as strong and capable as he was, couldn't take on the cartel alone. They would have to fight, to make a stand somewhere down the line. Sofia's thoughts turned to her family, her father and mother, and what might be happening to them now. They had no idea what was happening to her. They had no idea that the cartel had come for her. A low growl from Max broke her train of thought. He had stopped moving again. His ears were perked, his nose to the air, and his eyes glinted in the dim light of the canyon. He could sense it before she could. "They're coming," Sofia whispered. Max slowly turned to look at her, his gaze meeting hers, and for a moment, Sofia felt a flood of understanding pass between them. It was time. They were no longer running from the cartel. They were going to face them head-on. Max was ready, and now, so was she. The weight of the decision hit Sofia like a wave. There was no turning back now. She had been running for so long, hiding, fearing for her life. But now, with Max by her side, it was time to face the people who had torn her life apart. She could feel the tension in the air, the silence between the rocks, and the faint sound of footsteps in the distance. They were close. The cartel soldiers were close, and this would be the moment when it all changed. Max didn't flinch. His body was poised, every muscle taut, his eyes fixed on the path ahead, waiting for the slightest hint of movement. He was trained for this, trained to protect, trained to fight. But he wasn't just protecting Sofia now. He was fighting for their survival. Sofia's heart pounded in her chest as she crouched beside Max, her hand resting on his sleek coat, trying to steady her breath. She could feel the rising fear in her chest, a primal instinct to run, to flee, but she knew better. She couldn't keep running forever. Max had come for her. Now it was her turn to stand by him. The sound of the cartel soldiers grew louder, their boots crunching against the gravel, their voices drifting through the canyon. They were almost upon them. Sofia could make out the shape of the first soldier, just a silhouette against the dim light, his flashlight moving across the rocks in front of him. The others were close behind, their heavy breathing matching her own. Max's eyes flashed towards Sofia, and in that moment, she understood what he needed from her. It wasn't just about running anymore. It wasn't just about survival. It was about fighting back. They were going to have to make a stand. Sofia gripped the knife she'd found earlier, the cold metal comforting in her hand. She had no idea how to use it properly, but the desperation she felt now, the raw fear of being caught, pushed her into action. She wasn't alone. She had Max. She had the will to fight. Max was already moving, his body gliding like a shadow, his paws silent on the rocks as he crept forward. Sofia followed, her movements stiff but determined. They were close now, closer than ever before, and she could feel the impending sense of danger closing in. But as they neared the mouth of the ravine, Sofia saw it. One of the cartel soldiers stepped into view. He was alone, scanning the canyon walls for any signs of movement. He didn't see Max and Sofia, crouched just behind the rock ledge. He didn't hear the silent warning growl that Max emitted, too quiet for the man to understand. Max sprang into action, moving with lightning speed, his body a blur as he lunged at the soldier, knocking him off his feet. The soldier let out a surprised shout, his weapon flying from his hands as he struggled to break free. But Max was relentless, using every bit of his training to overpower the man. His sharp teeth sank into the soldier's arm, forcing him to the ground, immobilizing him. Sofia couldn't help but watch in awe as Max held the soldier down, his body a controlled force of nature. She had always known Max was capable, but seeing him in action like this filled her with a strange mixture of pride and fear. This was real. This was no game, and they were in the middle of a battle they couldn't afford to lose. But the fight had only just begun. More soldiers were approaching. Sofia could hear the clink of rifles, the murmur of voices, and the crunch of gravel beneath heavy boots. They were coming, and Max couldn't take them all on alone. Sofia tightened her grip on the knife, her body tensed for what was to come. Max was still holding the soldier down, but there were others, and they would be upon them any second now. She glanced at the shadows ahead and saw them. The remaining cartel soldiers, rounding the bend of the canyon. They were closing in, their faces twisted in anticipation, knowing they were just moments away from capturing their prize. Max's growl echoed through the ravine, a fierce warning. But Sofia knew that now, it wasn't just about Max. She had to act. She stepped forward, holding the knife in front of her, her eyes fixed on the nearest soldier. She didn't have much of a chance, but she wasn't going to let fear dictate her fate. One of the soldiers, seeing her, raised his rifle, his finger moving to the trigger. Max noticed it immediately. With a powerful surge, he released the man he'd been holding down, spinning toward the soldier, and lunged with a force that knocked the rifle from his hands. The soldier barely had time to react before Max pinned him to the ground with a savage growl. Sofia's breath caught in her throat. She had to act now. She ran toward the last soldier, the one who had his rifle aimed directly at her, and before he could fire, she shoved the knife into his arm, forcing him back. The shock of the attack disoriented him for a moment, and Sofia wasted no time. She pressed harder, using her weight to knock him off balance. Max had already moved on to the next soldier, his teeth sinking into the man's leg with a brutal precision, taking him down with ease. The battle was far from over, but Sofia felt something shift in the air. The tables were turning. They were fighting back, and the cartel hadn't been prepared for this. One by one, the remaining cartel members fell. They had underestimated the fight in Sofia and Max, and it was costing them. The last soldier, seeing his comrades downed, hesitated, his eyes wide with disbelief. Max stood in front of Sofia, his body poised, his ears back. He had her back. She could feel the power of their bond, the strength of their teamwork, and for the first time, she felt like she wasn't just running from danger. She was fighting for her life. The remaining cartel soldier hesitated, his hand trembling as he reached for his gun. But Sofia didn't give him the chance to react. She moved fast, throwing herself at him and knocking him off balance. Max was there in an instant, his powerful jaws closing around the man's wrist, pinning him down. Sofia stood over him, her breath ragged, the weight of the moment crashing over her. She had done it. They had done it. The cartel had underestimated them. They had thought they could just grab Sofia, take her for ransom, and use her as a pawn in their game. But now, they were the ones trapped. Max growled low, his teeth still bared, keeping the last soldier immobilized, as Sofia caught her breath. "We're not finished yet," she muttered, the words barely audible over the sound of the desert wind. And with that, they moved forward, knowing the cartel was far from done. But they weren't afraid anymore. They would fight until the end. Max kept his grip tight on the cartel soldier's arm, the man's face pale and filled with fear. The once confident, hardened cartel operative now trembled beneath Max's unyielding strength. Sofia stood beside him, her breath still coming in sharp bursts as she tried to calm herself. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, leaving a hollow ache in her bones. They had won this skirmish, but the war was far from over. Sofia's eyes darted to the fallen cartel soldiers scattered across the ravine floor. They were incapacitated, but she knew that the rest of the cartel wouldn't take long to regroup. This was only a temporary victory. "Where are the others?" she demanded, her voice tight with fear, yet laced with the resolve she had never known she had before. The soldier beneath Max stammered, sweat pouring down his face. He was trying to say something, but Max's pressure on his arm made it nearly impossible to get the words out. Sofia moved closer, her knife still clutched in her hand, the tip of it glinting in the moonlight. She could feel the weight of the moment. She wasn't just protecting herself now. She was protecting Max, and they both knew the danger that still loomed. There, the soldier rasped, trying to speak through the fear and pain. At the old warehouse, the one on the outskirts of town, Sofia's heart skipped a beat. The warehouse. She knew exactly where he was talking about. A desolate structure outside of Rio Verde, abandoned long ago but still used by the cartel for their illicit activities. It was the perfect place to hide and hold someone captive. Her father had warned her about it once, but that was before she even realized the depth of the cartel's reach. "Take us there," Sofia said, her voice cold, her eyes never leaving the soldier's face. "Now," Max growled low, pressing harder on the man's arm, the threat clear in his posture. He wasn't going to let anyone get away. Sofia stepped closer to the soldier, her stance shifting from one of hesitation to one of command. But the soldier wasn't the only one with an escape plan. Suddenly, the soldier jerked his head back, his eyes flashing with fear. His hand moved in a desperate attempt to reach for something, His radio? Sofia's pulse raced. She'd forgotten about the radios the cartel used to communicate. The signal could reach anyone nearby. If they were about to alert reinforcements, they would need to act fast. Max seemed to sense the danger in that split second. His fangs glinted in the moonlight as he tightened his hold on the soldier, and before Sofia could react, the soldier's hand went limp. Max had snapped the man's wrist, rendering him helpless. The radio fell from the soldier's grip, its crackling sound filling the air for a brief moment before going silent. Sofia stood there for a heartbeat, watching the soldier writhe beneath Max's unyielding grip. The message was clear. There would be no mercy from either side. The cartel wouldn't hesitate to kill her and Max if they had the chance. And she was done running. "Let him go," Sofia said, the words coming out sharp, almost detached. "But we don't have much time. We need to move." Max released the man with a final growl, watching as the cartel soldier scuttled away, fear still evident in his wide eyes. But Sofia wasn't about to let him live. She quickly grabbed a heavy rock and hurled it in the soldier's direction, hitting him in the leg, sending him stumbling back. He fell to the ground, cursing under his breath, but Sofia knew he wouldn't dare chase after them. They were alone again, but the knowledge that the cartel wasn't far behind set Sofia's mind racing. She turned to Max, who was already moving, his focus sharp, eyes scanning the path ahead. There was no time to waste. "We head to the warehouse," she said, voice steady, though her heart was pounding. "We end this now." The air seemed to grow thicker as they moved through the desert, the night closing in around them. The ravine gave way to an open stretch of land, the warehouse now visible in the distance, dark and looming, like a shadow against the stars. Sofia's eyes narrowed as they neared the structure. She had no idea what awaited them inside, but she didn't care. She had come this far. There was no turning back now. Max's every muscle was tense, and Sofia could feel the heat of his presence behind her. He was her shield, her protector, and he wouldn't stop until the last cartel member was brought down. Sofia had to believe that. She had to believe in their ability to fight back. They reached the edge of the warehouse, and Sofia felt her nerves begin to settle into a kind of cold resolve. The final confrontation was here. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. "Ready?" Sofia whispered to Max, her hand tightening on the knife she still carried. Max's ears flicked back as he looked up at her, his body still and focused. His eyes locked with hers, and for a brief moment, Sofia felt a surge of understanding between them. This wasn't just about getting her back home. It wasn't just about escaping. This was about taking down the cartel, destroying their grip on everything and everyone. Max gave a low, rumbling growl, and Sofia knew exactly what he was saying. "We're ready." The doors of the warehouse were slightly ajar, the dim light from within spilling into the desert night. Sofia's hand trembled as she gripped the knife, but her mind was sharp. She wasn't scared anymore. She was prepared to fight. They would make their stand here. They would end this tonight. The cartel had made one fatal mistake, underestimating them. They had no idea what they were facing. Sofia stepped forward, following Max into the shadows. The door creaked softly as Sofia and Max slipped into the dimly lit warehouse. The scent of rusted metal and old machinery filled the air, thick with the dust of years forgotten. The large space stretched out before them, shadows pooling in the corners, and the faint echo of voices carried through the silence. The cartel had to be close. Sofia could hear them. Gruff murmurs, the clinking of weapons, the occasional laugh that chilled her to the bone. They were confident. They thought they had one. But they couldn't have been more wrong. Max moved in front of Sofia, his body low to the ground, his fur blending with the darkness. He was completely silent, a trained killer in his own right. His focus was razor-sharp as he moved through the shadows, listening to every sound, sensing every vibration in the floor beneath their feet. Sofia could feel the tension building in the air. There was no turning back now. They reached the far side of the warehouse, where a stack of old crates provided the perfect cover. Sofia crouched down beside Max, her heart hammering in her chest. She could feel her breath quicken, the cold steel of the knife pressed tightly in her hand. But this wasn't the time for hesitation. She had fought for her survival this far, and with Max beside her, She would make sure that the cartel never took another breath. Sofia took a slow, measured breath, her eyes locked on Max. He was watching the cartel soldiers, waiting for the right moment to strike. Every muscle in her body was taut, every sense heightened, as she prepared for the inevitable clash. The moment of reckoning had arrived. There was movement ahead. A figure, a cartel soldier, stepped out from behind a stack of crates, rifle in hand, scanning the area. He didn't see them. He didn't even sense the danger lurking just a few feet away. Sofia and Max exchanged a quick look. This was their chance. Max was the first to move. Without a sound, he pounced, his massive body springing forward with deadly precision. The soldier barely had time to react as Max knocked him to the ground, his jaws snapping shut around the man's arm, pinning him with brutal force. The soldier gasped, the rifle falling from his hand as he struggled beneath Max's weight. But it was already too late. Max was relentless, holding the man in place with a ferocity that left no room for escape. Sofia moved quickly, stepping up beside Max, her knife poised in her hand, ready to strike if needed. But she didn't need to. Max had already incapacitated the soldier. He was done. Sofia watched as the soldier writhed beneath Max, helpless, unable to defend himself. The realization hit her then. This was no longer about survival. It was about taking down the empire that had terrorized her town, that had torn her life apart. And it was about protecting everyone who would come after her. Max released the soldier, pushing him aside as he moved silently toward the next group of cartel members. Sofia followed closely behind, staying low, her heart still pounding in her chest, the adrenaline pumping through her veins. They couldn't let up now, not when they were so close. The next group of cartel soldiers was clustered around a large table in the center of the room, focused on a map. Their voices were low, their attention diverted. Sofia and Max exchanged a glance. They would need to move quickly. Max crept forward, his movements fluid, almost ghostly in the dim light. Sofia followed closely behind, her breath steady, her mind clear. They were moving in for the kill. They weren't going to let the cartel take anything else from them. Max moved in first. In a single, fluid motion, he launched himself at the closest soldier, knocking him back, his jaws sinking into the man's leg, bringing him down with a loud scream. The other soldiers scrambled to react, but they were too slow. Max was faster. Sofia wasn't far behind. She rushed forward, her knife raised, and with a swift motion, she buried it in the nearest soldier's side, driving the blade deep into his ribs. He gasped in shock, his hands clutching at the wound, but it was too late. He collapsed to the floor, his life slipping away. The remaining cartel soldiers roared in anger, but it was already too late. Max was on them, his teeth flashing as he took down one soldier after another with ruthless efficiency. Sofia moved alongside him, her knife flashing as she struck with precision. Her fear transformed into something colder, something more determined. She was no longer just a scared little girl running from the cartel. She was fighting for her life, and she was going to win. One soldier tried to pull a gun, but Max was on him in an instant, knocking the weapon from his hand, sending him sprawling to the floor. Sofia moved forward, her breath coming in quick bursts, her hand shaking with the aftermath of the fight. She didn't hesitate. She drove the knife into the man's chest with all the force she could muster. The last cartel soldier, seeing the carnage around him, turned to flee, but Max was too quick. With a snarl, he pounced, knocking the man to the ground, holding him there with a strength that only a trained military dog could possess. Sofia stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest, her hands covered in blood. She could feel the rage boiling inside her, but she kept it in check. This was the end. "Where are the rest?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. The soldier trembled beneath Max, his breath shallow, his eyes wide with fear. You don't know what you've done," he gasped. "You've killed us all." Sofia narrowed her eyes. "Where are they? The rest of your men?" "They're at the safe house," the soldier muttered, his voice weak. They'll come for you. All of you." Sofia's heart dropped at the mention of the safe house. It wasn't over. Not yet. She looked at Max, and without a word, He released the soldier, letting him scramble to his feet and flee. There was no need to finish him off. He wouldn't survive long, not with the injuries he'd sustained. But Sofia wasn't focused on the soldier anymore. She was focused on what he had said, the safe house. She had to get to it. They had to stop the cartel before they could regroup and retaliate. Max turned toward her, his eyes intense, and Sofia knew he was ready. They would take the fight to the safe house. They would finish this once and for all. The night air was still heavy with the scent of dust and blood as Sofia and Max moved swiftly through the abandoned warehouse. The chaos they had just unleashed on the cartel members inside echoed in the silence, their bodies left behind as proof of their failure. Sofia's heart was still pounding, the adrenaline of the battle coursing through her veins. But there was no time to pause. She couldn't afford to think about what she had just done. Killing, fighting for her life. All that mattered now was getting to the safe house, finding the heart of the cartel, and ending this. Max led the way, his movements smooth, calculated, every step purposeful. His eyes were sharp, scanning every corner of the warehouse and the surrounding grounds. He knew what was at stake. He had fought beside Sofia, but now, their mission had grown beyond survival. This was about taking back control of their lives and ending the cartel's reign of terror. Sofia could feel the weight of the moment settling in her chest. Her hand tightened around the knife she still held, the cold metal a reminder of the violence she had just been a part of. But there was no room for hesitation, no room for weakness. She had seen what the cartel was capable of, and she had no intention of letting them take anything else from her. They had taken her father's life, threatened her family, and kidnapped her. But now they had made a deadly mistake. They had underestimated Max, and they had underestimated her. Max's low growl broke her thoughts, snapping her back into the present. He had stopped moving, his body tense, his ears flicking back. Sofia froze, her breath catching in her throat. She knew something was wrong. Ahead of them, the faint glow of lights illuminated the entrance to the safe house. It was a small building, tucked away in the middle of nowhere. A place where the cartel likely kept their weapons, drugs, and anyone they needed to control. Sofia's instincts told her that this was it, the heart of the cartel's operations. And it was all about to come to an end. Max's growl deepened, a warning that sent a chill down Sofia's spine. She moved forward cautiously, staying close to him, her eyes scanning the area. The shadows stretched long under the faint moonlight, and Sofia couldn't help but feel the oppressive weight of what they were about to face. The cartel was powerful, and this wasn't going to be easy. As they neared the safe house, the sound of voices reached Sofia's ears, muffled by the walls of the building. She couldn't make out what they were saying, but she knew they were preparing for something, likely a defense against any intruders. They had to know they were coming. The cartel wasn't dumb. Max's muscles tensed again as he crouched low to the ground. He was waiting for the right moment, the perfect time to strike. Sofia's grip tightened on the knife, the reality of their situation becoming painfully clear. This wasn't just about escaping anymore. This was about taking the cartel down, ending their control once and for all. The doors to the safe house swung open, and Sofia's heart lurched as she saw two cartel soldiers standing just outside. They hadn't spotted her or Max yet. She glanced at Max, and in that fleeting moment, their connection solidified. They were in this together. There was no turning back. Sofia held her breath as Max darted forward, a blur of motion that was almost too fast to follow. He took down the first soldier with a swift bite to the neck, the man's scream echoing into the night before he fell to the ground. The second soldier spun around, drawing his weapon, but Sofia was already moving, her feet pushing her forward with a surge of panic and adrenaline. She hurled herself at the second soldier, the knife in her hand flashing through the air, slashing across his chest. He staggered back, gasping for air, but it was too late. Sofia didn't hesitate. She thrust the knife deeper, his life slipping away with each second. Max was already moving past her, heading for the door to the safe house. He didn't wait for Sofia. He never did. He was always a step ahead, a protector at the core. But this time, she was with him, every step of the way. Sofia followed, her body tense, her thoughts sharp and focused. The door to the safe house was ajar, and she could hear movement inside. The cartel was preparing for a fight, but they didn't know who they were up against. Max had already slipped inside, moving like a shadow through the dim light. Sofia followed quickly, her pulse thundering in her ears as she stepped into the room. She immediately ducked behind a pile of crates, her eyes searching the room. The safe house was larger than she'd imagined, filled with crates, old furniture, and weapons stacked in the corner. She could see at least 5 cartel soldiers inside, all armed, all dangerous. Max's eyes locked onto the first soldier, his body low to the ground, his muscles coiled, waiting. Sofia's heart raced, but she kept her breathing steady. They had the element of surprise. They just needed to act fast. Without a sound, Max lunged, knocking the first soldier to the ground. Sofia followed his lead, her knife slicing through the air as she took down the second soldier in a blur of motion. The chaos was instantaneous. Gunfire erupted from the remaining cartel members, but Max and Sofia were already on the move, their bodies fluid, precise, as they dismantled the cartel's defense one soldier at a time. The remaining soldiers scrambled, their voices frantic as they tried to regroup. But it was too late. They couldn't recover. Max was already on them, his fangs sinking into one man's arm, forcing him to drop his weapon. Sofia, determined and filled with rage, took down the last soldier with a swift strike to the throat, leaving him gasping for air. The room fell silent, the echoes of the battle still hanging in the air. Sofia's chest heaved, the weight of the fight sinking in. But they had won. They had taken down the cartel's most powerful men in the safe house. And now, they were no longer running. They were in control. Max padded over to her, his eyes meeting hers as if to say, "We've won this battle." But they both knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The cartel was far-reaching, and Sofia still had no idea what her father had been involved in. But one thing was certain. With Max by her side, they could take on anything. Max's growl rumbled low in his throat, his ears alert. Sofia followed his gaze to the door, where the faint sound of approaching footsteps could be heard. Reinforcements. It wasn't over yet. The footsteps grew louder. The faint sounds of voices, faint orders, and hurried movement told Sofia that the cartel reinforcements were almost here. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she couldn't afford to panic. She couldn't let fear take over now. Not when they were so close to destroying the cartel's hold on everything. Max's body was tense, every muscle coiled with anticipation. His ears flicked toward the door, his growl low and steady, as if warning anyone who dared to enter. Sofia's grip tightened around the knife in her hand. She had no time to think about what had already happened. No time to process the adrenaline rush of the fight they had just survived. There were more enemies on the way. She couldn't let them regroup. The safe house felt like a ticking time bomb now, and Sofia had no intention of waiting for the cartel to make their next move. She looked over at Max, their eyes meeting for a brief moment, understanding passing between them without a word. They were in this together, and this was their last chance to finish what they had started. She moved first, slipping around the crates with quick, quiet steps. Max followed her, his body low to the ground, every sense heightened. They would make sure they didn't get caught. They would strike before the reinforcements could organize. As they reached the edge of the room, Sofia's eyes darted toward the entrance. 2 cartel soldiers appeared in the doorway, their eyes scanning the room. They hadn't seen her or Max yet. Sofia's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment when everything could change. Max didn't wait. With a snarl, he lunged, his powerful body a blur of motion as he attacked the first soldier. The man barely had time to react as Max knocked him off his feet, sinking his teeth into his arm and rendering him unable to fight back. The second soldier raised his rifle, but Sofia was already on the move. With a burst of speed, she closed the distance between them, diving toward him, the knife in her hand flashing as she slashed at his exposed side. The soldier cried out, stumbling backward, but it was too late. With one final, deadly thrust, Sofia drove the knife into his chest, her hands shaking as the life drained from him. The room fell silent again. Sofia stood over the soldier, her breath shallow, her mind still racing with the aftermath of the fight. She had done it. They had done it. But this wasn't over. The cartel's empire wouldn't fall so easily. There were still more of them. More of them out there, waiting for their chance to strike. Max moved swiftly to her side, his body tense, his eyes darting to the door. Sofia could feel the shift in the air. They were no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting to destroy the cartel, to ensure that no one would ever again have to live under their control. "Stay low," Sofia whispered to Max, though she knew he didn't need the reminder. He was always ahead of her, always thinking 2 steps ahead. They had to be ready. This fight wasn't just about taking down the men in the safe house. It was about dismantling everything the cartel had built. They moved through the building, their steps silent, their bodies fluid as they navigated the rooms. The walls of the safe house were lined with crates, weapons, and crates of supplies. Evidence of the cartel's operations, their distribution networks, and their unyielding grip on the region. Sofia couldn't help but feel a surge of disgust as they moved past the weapons. These had been used to kill, to control, to terrorize innocent people, and she was about to make sure they would never be used again. Max led the way to the back of the building, where a small staircase led to a loft area. Sofia's eyes narrowed as she saw movement above. More cartel soldiers, likely preparing to fight back, getting ready for their retaliation. It was now or never. Max stopped at the base of the stairs, his body crouched, his eyes locked on the loft above. Sofia crouched beside him, taking a deep breath. This was their moment. They couldn't wait any longer. Max moved again, quicker this time, springing up the stairs with a speed and grace that left no room for hesitation. Sofia followed, her pulse racing, her hands trembling. They reached the top and she saw them. The remaining cartel soldiers, their backs turned, their weapons ready. They were preparing for something, probably expecting an attack from outside. But they never saw Max coming. In one seamless motion, Max leapt onto the first soldier, knocking him to the ground with brutal force. The soldier's rifle clattered to the floor, his body pinned by Max's weight. Before the second soldier could react, Max had already shifted to him, his powerful jaws clamping down on the man's wrist, forcing the rifle from his hands. Sofia didn't hesitate. She darted forward, her knife raised, her mind focused. The remaining soldier had just drawn his pistol, but he didn't have time to aim before Sofia was upon him. She slashed, her blade finding its target, her heart hammering in her chest as the soldier dropped, gasping for air. Max released the man beneath him, his eyes scanning the room for any remaining threats. They had taken out the last of the cartel soldiers in the safe house. The building was now silent. Sofia stood over them, her hands shaking, her breath still ragged from the battle. She could feel the weight of the moment settling over her. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about ending the cartel's reign, about ensuring that no one else would suffer at their hands. She turned to Max, who was already scanning the room, his body poised for action. They had won, but the war was far from over. Sofia knew that the cartel's influence stretched far beyond this warehouse, and the fight was still ongoing. "We're not done," she whispered, her voice filled with resolve. "We need to finish what we started." Max gave a low growl, as if in agreement. Together, they had taken down the cartel's stronghold in this part of the region. But Sofia knew that if they were going to truly bring down the empire, they needed to keep pushing forward. This was just the beginning, and she would make sure they saw it through. The warehouse fell silent, the only sound the soft creaking of metal and wood in the breeze that filtered through the broken windows. The bodies of the cartel soldiers lay scattered across the floor, the faint scent of gunpowder lingering in the air. But Sofia didn't have time to process the grim reality of what had just happened. She couldn't afford to think about it now. There was still work to be done. She had a purpose, and so did Max. Max stood beside her, his body still tense, his eyes never leaving the entrance. The danger wasn't over. Not yet. They had wiped out the cartel soldiers inside, but the rest of the cartel was still out there. Sofia's mind raced. They knew where she was, they knew what she had done, and they would come after her. But this time, she wasn't going to run. She wasn't going to hide. She was going to fight. Sofia glanced down at the knife in her hand, the blood still fresh on its blade. It felt heavy, almost unnatural, but she knew she needed it. She had already crossed a line that she could never uncross. There was no turning back. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about justice, about taking down the cartel, about ending their reign of terror once and for all. "Max," she said softly, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her, "we finish this now. We don't wait. We don't give them the chance to regroup." Max turned his head toward her, his golden eyes meeting hers. She could see the loyalty in his gaze, the understanding. He was ready. He had been ready from the moment they set foot in this war. Together, they moved through the warehouse, slipping past the lifeless bodies of the cartel soldiers they had just taken down. Sofia's heart was still pounding in her chest, her thoughts running in circles, but she knew what needed to be done. They had to head to the cartel's headquarters, take the fight to them, and ensure they couldn't harm anyone else. It was the only way to make sure they couldn't retaliate, couldn't rebuild their empire of fear and violence. They made their way out of the warehouse and into the still night air. The cool breeze hit Sofia's face, the scent of the desert settling in her lungs. The sky above was clear, but she could feel the weight of everything that had happened settling in. The cartel had come for her and her family. They had taken Sofia, her mother, her father. They had torn everything from her. But now, it was their turn to feel the consequences of their actions. As they moved through the darkened desert, the moonlight casting long shadows across the land, Sofia's mind couldn't help but wander to her father. He had always been the one to protect her, to keep her safe from the dangers of the world. But now, he was gone. The cartel had taken him, and there was nothing she could do to bring him back. But she could make sure that no one else had to go through what she had. She could make sure the cartel never hurt anyone again. Max led the way through the desolate terrain, his eyes scanning every inch of the desert. He moved with an eerie calm, every step deliberate, his instincts guiding him like a soldier on a mission. Sofia followed closely behind, her knife still clutched in her hand, her body poised for anything that might come their way. They had to be quick. They had to reach the cartel's headquarters before the reinforcements could arrive, before they could recover from the blow Sofia and Max had dealt them. As they approached the outskirts of the town, Sofia could see the faint glow of lights in the distance. The cartel's headquarters wasn't far now. She could feel the adrenaline building in her veins, the anticipation of the final confrontation. This was it, the moment they had been fighting for. The moment when the cartel would learn that they weren't untouchable. The moment when Sofia would finally take back control. They reached the outskirts of the compound, a heavily guarded area on the edge of town. The gates were shut tight, but Sofia knew the entrance would be guarded. She could already hear the faint sounds of voices, the shuffle of boots on gravel, the sound of radios crackling through the air. They were expecting trouble, but Max wasn't going to let that stop them. He had already crouched low, his body poised to spring into action, his eyes locked onto the guard at the front gate. Sofia followed his lead, staying low, moving with purpose, every step deliberate. The guard at the gate was distracted, his back turned as he checked his radio. Max didn't hesitate. He moved in like a shadow, silent and deadly, his powerful body leaping at the guard, knocking him to the ground before the man could even react. The guard tried to scramble for his weapon, but Max was faster. He was already on top of him, his jaws snapping, his body pinning the man down. Sofia moved forward, her knife raised, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't hesitate. The guard wasn't dead, but he was incapacitated, unable to fight back. She quickly tied him up, making sure he wouldn't alert the others to their presence. Max stood over her, his eyes scanning the compound. They were in. Now, they had to move quickly. The compound was vast, a sprawling fortress surrounded by high walls and guard towers. But Sofia knew they couldn't waste time. They had to find the cartel's leaders, the ones who were pulling the strings. They had to put an end to this. Max led the way through the compound, his movements fluid and silent. They passed by more guards, each one unaware of their presence, until they reached the main building. The doors were heavily guarded, but Max knew the layout. He knew the best way to get inside without being detected. Sofia's breath quickened as they approached the door. This was it, the final fight. Max crouched low, his eyes locked on the guards at the door. Sofia raised her knife, ready for whatever came next. They had come this far. They weren't going to stop now. The guards at the door turned just in time to see Max leap at them. In one fluid motion, Max knocked the first guard to the ground, while Sofia rushed forward, plunging her knife into the second guard's side before he could raise his weapon. They were in. The cartel's headquarters was theirs for the taking. The heavy door to the cartel's headquarters swung open with a low creak, and Sofia's pulse quickened. The sounds of Max's growling and the guard's shouts echoed through the hall, but Sofia couldn't afford to slow down. They had breached the compound, but the hardest part was yet to come. Inside this building lay the heart of the cartel's operations, their command center, where the true leaders held power, where the mastermind behind everything resided. Max was already moving, his body low to the ground, his eyes darting around as if scanning every inch of the room, anticipating the next threat. His growl was constant, a reminder that he was always on edge, always ready to strike. Sofia stayed close to him, her breath steadying despite the surge of adrenaline that coursed through her. She could feel the heat of the moment, the realization that everything they had fought for, everything they had sacrificed, was about to come to a head. They moved through the hallway, avoiding the guards that patrolled in and out of rooms. Sofia's heart pounded in her chest as she listened for any signs of movement. The weight of the knife in her hand was reassuring, the cold steel a reminder of how far she had come. Just a few days ago, she had been a scared little girl, unaware of the darkness the cartel had cast over her life. Now, she was a warrior, a protector, just like Max. They reached the large, reinforced door at the end of the hall. Sofia didn't need to see the markings on it to know what lay behind it. This was where it all came together. This was where the cartel's leaders gathered, making deals, issuing orders, planning their next move. And Sofia was about to bring it all down. Max stopped in front of the door, his body poised, his eyes locked on the metal barrier. Sofia could feel the electricity in the air, the tension that hung between them. This was their final fight. The door was locked, but Max didn't hesitate. He gave a soft growl, his body coiling, and in a flash, he lunged at the door with a force that seemed unnatural. His body slammed into the door with a deafening bang, splintering the wood. Sofia didn't wait for the door to fully collapse. She sprinted forward, her legs carrying her faster than she ever thought possible. Max was right behind her, his heavy paws pounding against the ground. She reached the door and pushed it open, her heart racing as she stepped into the inner sanctum of the cartel's operation. What she saw took her breath away. The room was vast, illuminated by a few scattered overhead lights, casting long shadows across the faces of the men sitting around the large conference table. Sofia didn't need to know who they were to understand the power they wielded. These were the men behind the cartel, dangerous, ruthless, and responsible for the pain and suffering of countless families. They hadn't expected anyone to breach their fortress. Max's growl was loud now, a warning to the men that there was no escaping what was coming. Sofia's heart hammered in her chest as she scanned the room, noting the presence of a few heavily armed guards near the walls. But they were caught off guard, just like the rest of the cartel soldiers. They weren't ready for Max. They weren't ready for Sofia. Queen Sunu Stets, one of the men at the table demanded, his voice a mix of disbelief and anger. He stood up, a tall man with slick black hair, his dark suit contrasting against the worn-down, filthy walls of the warehouse. He was the one in charge, Sofia could tell. His eyes flicked between her and Max, confusion and fear creeping into his gaze. Sofia didn't answer. She didn't need to. The only response she gave was the cold gleam of her knife as she stepped forward. Max was already moving, his body tensed, his gaze unwavering as he stalked toward the nearest guard, bringing him down in a flash of teeth and fury. The room erupted into chaos. The man in charge shouted orders, but it was too late. Max's fangs sank into the neck of one guard. Another soldier tried to raise a gun, but Sofia was quicker. She lunged, her knife plunging into his side before he could fire. The room seemed to blur as she fought, her every movement driven by a combination of anger, fear, and something else, something more powerful. She wasn't just protecting herself anymore. She wasn't just trying to survive. She was taking back control. Sofia's thoughts flashed back to the moment the cartel had taken her, to the fear she had felt when they ripped her away from her life, when they tore her family apart. They thought they could break her. But they had made a mistake. They had underestimated her, and now they were paying for it. The men at the table stood up, their eyes wide, but they were no match for the fury that Sofia and Max unleashed. One of the cartel leaders raised a pistol, aiming at Max, but Sofia didn't think. She acted. With a swift motion, she hurled her knife toward him, the blade slicing through the air and embedding itself deep into the man's shoulder. He screamed in pain, dropping the gun. The remaining soldiers tried to fight back, but they were overwhelmed. Max was everywhere at once, his powerful form leaping from one soldier to another, his jaws clamping down on their limbs, disarming them with brutal efficiency. Sofia's heart raced as she fought side by side with him, their movements synchronized as if they had done this 1,000 times before. And then, as quickly as it had started, the chaos ended. The cartel's leaders lay on the floor, their bodies incapacitated, some dead, some groaning in pain. Max stood over them, his eyes cold, a silent warning to anyone who dared to rise again. Sofia looked around the room, her breath shallow, her body covered in blood, but she didn't flinch. She had done it. They had done it. The cartel was finished. Sofia stood tall, her chest rising and falling with every breath. Her eyes met Max's, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she smiled. They had won. They had fought for their lives, for their freedom, and they had claimed it. Max had been there from the beginning, her protector, her partner in this fight. And now, they had brought down the empire that had terrorized them both. But as Sofia looked around the room, she knew the fight wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The cartel had been brought to its knees, but there were still remnants of it out there. The battle for the future was just beginning. Max moved beside her, his body brushing against hers in a silent gesture of solidarity. Together, they would make sure that no one ever had to live in fear again. The quiet aftermath of the battle still hung heavy in the room, the echoes of gunfire and the sounds of struggling soldiers fading into nothing. Sofia stood amidst the wreckage, her breath coming in deep, controlled gasps. The adrenaline rush that had kept her moving now began to ebb away, leaving her with the realization of just how much they had accomplished. The cartel's empire, what had once seemed like an unstoppable force, was now in ruins. She had taken back control. Max stood beside her, his chest heaving, his fur matted with blood, but his eyes remained sharp, alert. The fight was over, but their mission wasn't. They were far from finished. Sofia knew this was just the beginning, and as she looked down at the bodies of the cartel members scattered across the room, she knew that they had only begun to dismantle the force that had destroyed her life. But there was no time to bask in victory. The door to the room creaked, and Sofia instinctively shifted into a defensive stance. Her knife was still in her hand, the cold metal almost comforting as she prepared for what came next. Her eyes scanned the room, and she noticed the last of the cartel leaders lying on the floor, groaning in pain. One of them was still conscious. The man with the slick black hair, the one who had shouted orders earlier, was still breathing, his eyes wide in fear, his body trembling. Sofia stepped toward him slowly, her footfalls silent on the blood-soaked floor. She could feel his gaze on her, could see the shock and confusion in his eyes. She knew what he was thinking. How could a little girl like you do this? How could you bring down an empire so vast, so powerful? But she wasn't just a little girl anymore. She had learned how to fight, how to survive, and she wasn't going to stop now. You, the cartel leader croaked, struggling to sit up. You have no idea what you've done. Sofia didn't flinch. I know exactly what I've done. I've ended you. The man scoffed weakly, his face twisted with a mixture of fear and defiance. You think this is over? The cartel? We're everywhere. You'll never be able to stop us. Sofia crouched down to meet his gaze. She could feel the weight of his words, but she refused to let him intimidate her. You're wrong, she said, her voice cold. This is over. Your reign ends tonight, and I'll make sure you never hurt anyone again. With that, she stood up and walked away from the cartel leader, her back straight, her heart resolute. She knew the truth in what she had said. They had already won. The cartel's hold on the region was shattered, and there would be no rebuilding it. Not after what she and Max had done. Max was already at the door, his body low to the ground. His ears perked up as he listened for any signs of movement outside. They had to move quickly. Sofia turned to him, her heart racing. They couldn't afford to stay here much longer. The cartel might have been taken down, but their allies, their remnants, were still out there, and they would be looking for revenge. They had to make sure no one else would come after them. After Sofia, after the innocent lives the cartel had destroyed. Max barked once, his voice deep and commanding, and Sofia nodded. She didn't need him to tell her what to do. She had already made her decision. They would take everything they had learned, every piece of evidence they could find, and bring it to the authorities. They would make sure that the cartel's influence was gone for good. But first, they had to leave this place. Sofia and Max moved swiftly through the building, their steps careful and deliberate. They passed the bodies of the men who had once believed themselves untouchable. She could almost feel their resentment lingering in the air, but she wasn't afraid anymore. Not of them, not of the cartel. They reached the back exit of the compound and pushed open the door, the night air cool against their faces. The compound was isolated, surrounded by empty desert, with only the distant lights of the town in the distance. Sofia didn't look back as they stepped into the night. The world felt different now. The weight of everything, the years of fear, the uncertainty, had lifted from her shoulders. It wasn't over, but for the first time, Sofia felt like she had the power to control her destiny. Max padded beside her, his body moving with ease through the darkness. He was more than just her protector. He was her partner in this fight. They had fought side by side, and together, they had brought down an empire. She didn't need anything else. Max had been there when her world fell apart, and now, he was the one who had helped her rebuild it. As they walked into the night, Sofia's mind was already planning their next move. She knew they couldn't stay in Rio Verde. The cartel's influence was far-reaching, and they had enemies everywhere. But for now, they were free. The people of this town, the families that had lived under the cartel's shadow, would finally have the chance to rebuild. They would have the chance to live without fear. Sofia smiled, the first genuine smile she'd had in what felt like forever. Max gave her a sideways glance, as if to say, "We did it." She reached down to scratch behind his ears, her heart swelling with pride. Together, they had taken on the impossible, and together, they would continue to fight for the future. As they disappeared into the night, the lights of Rio Verde faded behind them. But ahead, the world was theirs. The future was in their hands. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long, silver beams across the desert landscape. The cool breeze swept through the open plains, carrying with it a sense of calm, a brief respite after the violence that had unfolded just hours before. But Sofia knew that this peace was temporary. The cartel may have been brought to its knees, but there was still much to be done. Sofia's boots crunched softly against the sand and gravel as she walked alongside Max, who moved with the grace of a predator, his eyes scanning the surroundings as always. They were both exhausted. The past few days had taken everything from them, and yet, there was no time for rest. Sofia knew that the cartel's remnants, the broken pieces of their empire, were still out there, and they wouldn't hesitate to strike back. But now, with the leaders taken down, they were nothing but a fractured shell, and Sofia intended to make sure they stayed that way. Max turned to her, his golden eyes catching the faint light of the moon, as if to remind her they had work to do. She smiled at him, reaching down to ruffle his fur, feeling a moment of connection, a brief peace before the next battle. But even this small solace couldn't last forever. There were still enemies to hunt. "We'll make sure they can't hurt anyone else," she whispered to Max, though she knew he didn't need the reassurance. He had been with her through everything, from the first signs of danger to the final showdown in the cartel's headquarters. Together, they had taken down the heart of the empire. Now, they would ensure its collapse. They had decided not to stay in Rio Verde. The town, though their home, was now too dangerous. Too many eyes, too many who could still be loyal to the cartel. The remaining factions would come for them. Sofia wasn't willing to wait for them to make the first move. They needed to go underground, gather more information, and make sure the cartel could never rise again. Max led the way through the darkened desert, his nose twitching as he picked up on every scent, every shift in the air. Sofia followed, her mind buzzing with plans, wondering if the authorities would be able to handle what they had left behind. The cartel's operations were far-reaching: drugs, weapons, human trafficking, and without their leadership, the organization might crumble under the weight of its own corruption. But the remnants of it would still try to fight. And that's where she and Max came in. They didn't stop until the first rays of the morning sun began to peek over the horizon. The desert was vast, stretching for miles in every direction. And though it offered no shelter, it also offered something else: freedom. They had escaped the immediate danger, but Sofia knew that danger was always lurking. Max came to a stop, his ears pricking up at something in the distance. Sofia paused too, sensing the change in the air, the quiet tension that always preceded a fight. Her hand instinctively moved to the knife at her side, but she didn't draw it yet. Whatever it wasn't close. She waited, her breath still, every muscle in her body tuned to the rhythm of the desert around her. And then, she saw them. In the distance, just a few hundred yards away, a black SUV rolled slowly across the sand. It was a familiar sight. Sofia's stomach tightened. The cartel was still out there. They hadn't given up. Max growled low, his body tensing at her side. Sofia didn't move. She wasn't about to make the same mistake twice. They would wait for the right moment. There was no need to reveal their position just yet. The SUV was slow, too slow. It wasn't expecting anyone to be out here. The cartel thought they were safe. But Sofia and Max had already proven that they weren't. The SUV stopped about 50 yards away, and two men stepped out. One was tall, wearing a dark suit, the other shorter, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. They both looked around, scanning the area as if expecting someone. Sofia's heart pounded in her chest. She had no doubt that they were looking for her. Max turned his head to her, and she could almost hear the silent command in his eyes. "Wait." She crouched low, pulling back behind a large rock, her body pressing into the earth, her breath steady, quiet. Her eyes never left the two men. She knew they weren't the only ones. More would be coming. The taller man pulled a walkie-talkie from his belt and spoke into it, his voice low but urgent. Sofia could hear the static and then the faint words. "They can't be far. We know they're here. Find them." The shorter man nodded, his hand drifting toward the gun holstered at his side. They weren't just looking for anyone. They were looking for her and Max. They had been hunting them since the safe house. Sofia's fingers tightened around the knife hilt. She had to make a choice. She could keep hiding, keep running, but that wasn't going to work forever. She had already destroyed the heart of the cartel, but now she had to finish it. Max's low growl broke her thoughts, and before she could decide, the taller man turned and, without warning, took a step toward them. The sound of gravel crunching under his boots was the signal. Max moved in a blur, faster than Sofia could react, leaping from his hiding spot toward the men. Sofia didn't hesitate. She rushed forward, her knife raised, her every step filled with the power of everything she had done up until this point. The men had underestimated them, again. Max took the first man down with a vicious swipe, knocking him to the ground, his fangs flashing as he pinned the man's arms. Sofia reached the second man in seconds, her knife slashing out to disarm him before he could draw his gun. The shorter man tried to fight back, but Sofia's strike was swift, leaving him incapacitated before he could even react. The two cartel men were no longer a threat. Breathing heavily, Sofia looked down at them, her heart still racing, the rush of combat making her pulse thunder in her ears. She hadn't let herself feel fear in that moment. She had only reacted, and it was because of Max. He trotted over to her, his fur matted with dust and sweat, but his gaze unwavering. Sofia couldn't help but smile, a real smile this time. They had done it again. They had survived. But there was more to do, more to clean up. Max's growl interrupted her thoughts again, and she turned just in time to see a third man, sneaking around the side of the SUV, his gun raised. Sofia's heart skipped a beat. Without thinking, she reached for the rifle strapped to her back, pulling it free. With a steady aim, she fired once, twice, hitting the man square in the chest. He dropped instantly, his body crumpling to the ground. Sofia stood there for a moment, her breath coming in sharp gasps as she scanned the area for any more threats. Max's eyes never left her, the silent protector. She lowered the rifle, her heartbeat still pounding in her chest. But it wasn't over. It would never be over until every last piece of the cartel had been dismantled. She turned to Max, her voice steady but filled with determination. "We're not done yet, buddy. There's more to finish." Max gave a low whine in agreement, and together, they walked away from the wreckage of the cartel's final attempt at revenge. The desert stretched before them, empty and vast. And though the road ahead was long, Sofia knew one thing for sure. As long as she and Max were together, they would keep fighting until the very end. The silence of the desert weighed heavily on Sofia as she and Max moved farther from the wreckage they'd left behind. The sun was beginning to rise, casting an orange glow across the endless stretch of sand and sagebrush that surrounded them. The faint wind kicked up dust, swirling it around their feet as they walked side by side. It was peaceful, too peaceful after all the chaos. But Sofia didn't allow herself to feel relief. Not yet. The cartel might have been weakened, its leadership destroyed, but there was still one crucial piece to this puzzle, the one who had orchestrated it all, the one who had orchestrated her family's downfall. Max walked ahead of her, his movements confident, the quiet hum of his growl reminding Sofia that he, too, was on edge. They both knew the game wasn't over. They had to find the remnants of the cartel, the ones who had escaped the carnage, and make sure they couldn't rebuild. There would be no peace until every last one of them was accounted for. As they made their way toward the town outskirts, Sofia's thoughts drifted to the leader of the cartel, the one she had never met, the shadow figure who had been pulling all the strings from behind the scenes. She had seen his face only once in a fleeting photograph, but he had left a mark on her life that no image could capture. His name was Esteban Alvarez, and from what she knew, he had been the real power behind the cartel, the architect of its reign of terror. Sofia's grip tightened around the rifle slung across her back. Alvarez had made sure her father was murdered. He had taken control of her life, and now she was going to take his. They reached the outskirts of the small town, the sun higher in the sky now, casting long shadows. The streets were eerily quiet. It had been days since the cartel's forces had swept through the area, terrorizing everyone they touched. But in the stillness of this moment, Sofia couldn't help but feel that the town had been forever changed. It was as if the town had forgotten how to breathe in the wake of the cartel's power. Max's head jerked to the side, his sharp ears twitching as he picked up a sound in the distance. Sofia instinctively moved closer to him, her senses alert. They had stopped just at the edge of town, and she wasn't sure if it was a false alarm or not. But the unease she felt deep inside her told her it was time to be cautious. She scanned the surroundings, noting the empty streets, the abandoned storefronts. Nothing moved. The heat of the desert air pressed against her skin, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of the wind. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence. Well, if it isn't the little survivor." Sofia whipped around, her hand instinctively going to the rifle at her back. There, standing in the middle of the street, was a figure she didn't expect. A man dressed in dark clothing, his hat pulled low over his face, a cigar dangling from his lips. He was leaning casually against the old gas station, the same smirk that had marked every cartel soldier she'd ever faced plastered on his face. It was him, Esteban Alvarez, the one responsible for all of it, the one who had caused her pain, who had killed her father. This was the man she had been searching for, the man she had vowed to destroy. Her heart raced in her chest, the heat of anger and fear mixing in a dangerous cocktail. She couldn't stop now. She had come too far to back down. Alvarez took a slow drag from his cigar and exhaled the smoke, watching her with a cold, calculating gaze. His eyes flicked to Max, who was already circling, his hackles raised. The dog could sense the danger, just as Sofia could. "You must be Sofia," Alvarez said, his voice smooth, almost mocking. "I've heard a lot about you. Quite the little fighter, aren't you?" Sofia didn't answer. Her pulse thudded in her ears. She was done with games. She was done with waiting. "What do you want, Alvarez?" she spat, her voice sharp with rage. "Oh, I don't want anything, sweetheart. I just wanted to see who had the audacity to tear down my empire," he said, his tone casual, as if he were talking about a minor inconvenience. "But I've got to admit, I'm impressed. You took down a lot of good men, my best men, but it's all over now. The cartel still stands. We always rebuild." Sofia's eyes narrowed, her grip tightening around the rifle. "You're wrong. This ends today. You're finished. Your empire is gone. And you're not walking out of here." Alvarez chuckled, the sound cold and dismissive. "Is that so? And what makes you think you're the one who gets to decide? You're just a little girl, Sofia. A pawn in a game you can't even begin to understand." Sofia's chest tightened. He still thought he could control everything, but not anymore. She wasn't a pawn anymore. And this time, she wasn't afraid of him. "I'm not your pawn," Sofia said, her voice unwavering. "And I'm not a little girl anymore." Max's low growl rumbled through the silence as he took a step forward, positioning himself between Sofia and Alvarez. The tension in the air was palpable, and Sofia knew that whatever happened next would be the final confrontation. She could feel it in her gut. This was the end of the road. She had made it this far, and she wasn't about to let Alvarez walk away. Alvarez didn't flinch. He just stared at her, his smirk never leaving his face. "You've got a lot of guts. But guts won't save you, Sofia." Before he could move, Sofia raised the rifle, her fingers steady on the trigger. She was prepared for this. She had prepared for this moment for days, for weeks. She couldn't afford to hesitate. "Goodbye, Alvarez," she whispered, her voice filled with the finality of it. A shot rang out, loud and final, breaking the silence of the desert. The shot rang through the desert air, shattering the quiet stillness that had hung over the town like a shroud. Sofia's breath caught in her throat as she watched the bullet soar through the air, its path unwavering, the rifle's kick still pulsing in her hand. Alvarez's eyes widened at the last moment, but it was too late. He never had a chance to respond. The bullet struck him in the chest with a sickening thud. His body jolted backward as he let out a shocked, strangled gasp. Sofia didn't move. She couldn't. The man who had torn apart everything she loved, who had destroyed her family, who had hunted her like an animal. It was all over. She had taken control, taken her future back. The world stood still for just a heartbeat. Alvarez collapsed onto the dusty ground, the cigar falling from his lips and rolling away in the wind. His body twitched once, then lay still. His eyes, wide and unblinking, stared up at the sky, devoid of the arrogance that had defined him. Max was the first to move. He stepped forward slowly, his tail stiff and his eyes fixed on the fallen cartel leader. Sofia stayed still, her hands still clutching the rifle, her knuckles white as she tried to process the weight of what had just happened. She had taken the life of the man who had taken so much from her, and though the rush of victory washed over her, there was no relief. Not yet. Max gave a low whine, standing over the body of Alvarez, but Sofia didn't need to say anything. She had already won. She had known it from the moment the bullet left the barrel. She dropped the rifle at her side and knelt next to Max, her knees sinking into the dry earth as she reached out to touch the dog's fur, the bond between them stronger than ever. Max looked up at her, his eyes softening as if he, too, understood that the weight of this moment had come to an end. Sofia exhaled shakily, closing her eyes as the enormity of everything she had done finally caught up with her. This was what it felt like to win, to be free. The guilt of what had transpired, the bloodshed, the violence, was there, but it was nothing compared to the years of fear, uncertainty, and hopelessness that had plagued her life under the cartel's rule. She had made it through. She had survived, and she had freed herself, her family, and everyone who had suffered in the shadow of the cartel. "Max," Sofia whispered, her voice hoarse from the exhaustion of everything they had been through. "We did it." Max nudged her gently with his nose, his ears pricked, as if to say, "We did it together." Sofia looked up at the empty road leading out of town, the horizon still illuminated by the early morning sun. She knew there was a long road ahead of them. It wasn't over. There were still remnants of the cartel to dismantle, still lives to rebuild. But for now, in this fleeting moment, Sofia felt something she hadn't felt in so long. Hope. The sun's rays slowly stretched across the land, as if ushering in a new beginning. For the first time, the town of Rio Verde felt like a place she could return to, a place she could call home again. But she wouldn't stay here, not yet. There were still too many unanswered questions, too much to untangle. But now, she had the power to do it. She stood, brushing the dust from her pants, and took a final look at the body of Esteban Alvarez. The man who had sought to break her had finally been stopped. She hadn't let him win. She had broken the cycle. "Come on, Max," Sofia said softly, as she turned toward the horizon. "We have a long journey ahead." Max padded beside her, his steps in sync with hers, and together, they began their walk down the desolate road, leaving the blood-stained history behind. Ahead of them, the future lay uncertain, but the world was theirs to shape. The sun was rising, and with it, the promise of a new day. As they walked away from the ruins of the cartel, Sofia's mind turned toward the people she had once known, the lives she had once dreamed of returning to. Her family had paid the ultimate price, but she would honor their memories by seeing this through. The battle was over, but the war for a peaceful future was only beginning. Sofia wasn't afraid anymore. She had faced down her past, defeated the empire that had terrorized her, and emerged victorious. The road ahead was full of challenges, but with Max at her side, there was nothing she couldn't face. Together, they would rebuild. Together, they would make sure the world would never be the same. And together, they would make sure that no one would ever have to live in fear again. The road stretched out before them, endless and quiet, the soft hum of the wind the only sound breaking the otherwise serene silence. Sofia's steps were measured, but her mind was racing, each thought a flurry of plans, hopes, and unanswered questions. Max trotted beside her, his presence grounding her, the steady rhythm of his paws a constant reassurance that they were in this together. They had won, but now it was time to rebuild. Sofia knew that the world they had left behind was one of ruin and fear. Her family was gone, and Rio Verde had been left broken in the wake of the cartel's chaos. The people she had once known, her friends, her neighbors, were scattered, lost, and scarred by the horrors the cartel had inflicted. Yet, now, they had a chance to heal. They had a chance to begin anew. But it wasn't going to be easy. The cartel's remnants were still lurking, hiding in the shadows, and the law enforcement wasn't enough to handle the remnants of an empire that had spread its corruption far and wide. But that was where Sofia came in. She had to make sure the pieces of the cartel that were left wouldn't have a chance to regrow. But more than that, Sofia was driven by something deeper. The need for justice, for those who couldn't defend themselves, for the innocent lives lost, and the families torn apart. The world needed to see that the cartel was no more, that its iron grip on communities like hers was finally shattered. The sun was now high in the sky, its light harsh and unyielding. The heat of the desert seemed to pulse around them, but Sofia didn't mind it. The sun was a symbol, in some ways, of everything they had overcome. The cartel had thrived in the shadows, but now, the light was breaking through. They walked for miles, with no clear destination in mind. Sofia hadn't fully decided where they would go next. She wanted to return to Rio Verde, to see what remained of the town, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it might be too dangerous, at least for now. She glanced over at Max, who was panting lightly as they made their way across the rugged landscape. He had been there with her through all of it, through the kidnap, through the bloodshed, through the years of fear. Max had never faltered. He had never abandoned her. Sofia couldn't imagine where she would have been without him. Max stopped suddenly, turning his head toward the distant hills. Sofia followed his gaze, her heart tightening as she squinted into the distance. She saw something there, movement. At first, she thought it might have been a mirage, the heat of the desert playing tricks on her. But then she saw it again, people, a small group, walking in their direction. Her instincts kicked in, but Max didn't seem alarmed. He stood at attention, ears forward, eyes alert but not threatened. Sofia hesitated for a moment, then made the decision to approach cautiously. It could be cartel remnants, or it could be survivors, people trying to escape the violence. She tightened her grip on her rifle, which hung loosely on her back. "Stay close, Max," she murmured. The closer they got, the clearer it became that they weren't Cartel. They were people like her, people who had escaped the horrors of the Cartel and were now trying to find a way to survive in a world that was suddenly full of possibilities, but also danger. As they got close enough, one of the figures raised a hand in greeting. A woman, her clothes ragged but her eyes full of resolve. Behind her, a few men and women trudged along, looking tired but hopeful. "You there?" the woman called out, her voice rough from the journey. Are you Sofia Garcia?" Sofia stopped dead in her tracks, surprise flickering in her chest. "I am," she answered cautiously, unsure of who these people were, but her curiosity overriding the wariness. The woman's face broke into a weary smile. "I knew it. I heard the stories. You brought down Alvarez, didn't you? You destroyed the Cartel?" Sofia didn't know how to respond. Her victory felt hollow in the face of the pain this woman had clearly endured. She nodded, though, her voice soft. "Yes, we took them down. Thank God," the woman whispered, her eyes glistening with tears that she quickly wiped away. "I've been waiting for this day. We've been running for so long. My family, they were taken by them." She glanced around at her companions, all of whom bore the same exhausted but determined look. Sofia's heart ached at the sight. The Cartel had hurt so many people, and even though she had avenged her father, she had avenged herself. She knew there were countless others still suffering, still in the grip of fear. "Are you headed to Rio Verde?" Sofia asked, her mind already ticking over what to do next. The woman shook her head. "We've heard the town's been through enough. It's going to take a long time to heal. We're heading to the mountains. There's a settlement there. Refugees like us, people who escaped the Cartel's wrath. We've been trying to find somewhere safe for the children." Sofia nodded, understanding. Rio Verde, for all its significance, wasn't the place to go yet. It needed time. It needed rebuilding. "I can help," Sofia said, her voice clear and strong. "I can help you get there. Max and I, we know the terrain. We can lead you through the desert." The woman looked at her, a mixture of awe and gratitude in her eyes. "You do that?" Sofia nodded. "You're not alone anymore. None of us are." They set off together toward the distant mountains, the small group of survivors falling into step behind her. Max led the way, his pace steady and sure, as if he knew this was just another part of the mission they had been given. To guide those in need, to ensure that no one else would suffer like they had. The journey was long, but they made it, through heat and dust, through silent nights filled with whispered conversations about hope and lost loved ones. Each step brought them closer to the safety they all desperately sought, and with each step, Sofia felt the weight of what they had done slowly lifting from her shoulders. Together, they would rebuild, and together, they would ensure that the Cartel's legacy was truly erased from the world. The mountains loomed in the distance, their jagged peaks cutting into the sky like dark sentinels. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of the desert, dry and unforgiving. But it didn't matter. To Sofia, the mountains represented something far greater than their harsh terrain. They symbolized a new beginning, a place of refuge for those who had suffered, for those who had been lost. The small group of survivors that had joined Sofia and Max was silent, moving in step with her, all of them driven by a singular, powerful purpose. The journey to the settlement in the mountains would take days, and they all knew it would be a grueling trek. But it was better than hiding in fear, better than being hunted by the remnants of the Cartel, and most importantly, it was a chance for a fresh start. Sofia glanced behind her to see the woman. Her name was Maria. Keeping pace with the others, her eyes scanning the horizon. Maria had been a mother to the small group, guiding them through the chaos of the Cartel's rule. She had lost her husband and child to the Cartel's violence, and yet, here she was, standing tall, determined to survive and protect those who were left. Maria caught Sofia's gaze and gave her a small, grateful smile. Sofia returned it with a nod, acknowledging their shared understanding. This was more than just survival now. It was about hope, about finding a way to heal the broken pieces of their lives. Max moved ahead, his ears pricked, his body tense as he led the way. The dog had always been a protector, but now, Sofia knew, he was more than that. He was the embodiment of their fight. He had been there through everything, and together, they had already achieved what no one thought was possible. The path through the desert was treacherous, the heat relentless under the midday sun, but they pushed on. Sofia kept her pace steady, refusing to let the exhaustion take hold. She couldn't afford to stop now, not when the finish line was so close, not when there was still work to be done. By the time they reached the base of the mountains, the sun had begun to dip low, casting long shadows across the land. Sofia's legs were sore from the long hours of walking, but there was a lightness in her chest that hadn't been there before. They were getting closer. The settlement was near, and with it, the possibility of a future that didn't involve fear and violence. "We'll make camp here for the night," Sofia said, her voice breaking the silence. The group nodded, weary but relieved to finally have a moment to rest. They gathered around a small fire that Maria had started, its flickering flames offering a temporary warmth against the chill of the desert night. As the group settled around the fire, Sofia sat apart for a moment, her thoughts drifting back to the events that had led her here. She thought about her father, the man who had taught her everything she knew, who had prepared her for this fight without even realizing it. He had always said that the greatest strength wasn't in taking a life, but in protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. He had given her the tools to survive, and now, she had used those tools to destroy the cartel. But the cost had been high. Her father was gone, and so many others had paid the price. The thought of it still weighed heavily on her heart. She hadn't been able to save everyone, but she had saved what she could, and now, she was here, with the chance to help rebuild, to make a difference for those who had lost everything. Max came to sit beside her, his body warm against her side. She reached down to stroke his fur, grateful for the bond they shared. She had never imagined that a dog could be so much more than just a companion. Max had been her rock through it all. Together, they had taken down the cartel, and together, they would help others rebuild what had been lost. "Thank you, Max," Sofia whispered. The words more for herself than for the dog. She didn't need to say it aloud for him to understand. He had been there when no one else had been. He had been her protector, her partner, and now, he was the one who made everything feel possible. Maria came over and sat beside Sofia, offering her a warm smile. The woman had become a friend, someone who understood the pain Sofia had gone through. "You did it," Maria said softly, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "You've given us a chance to live again." Sofia met her gaze, the weight of those words sinking in. She wasn't sure if she fully believed it yet, but Maria's words gave her something to hold on to, a spark of hope, however small. It was a hope that, with time, could grow into something stronger. "I didn't do it alone," Sofia said, her voice quiet but firm. "I couldn't have done it without Max. And I couldn't have done it without all of you." Maria nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We're all in this together now." As the night wore on, the campfire crackled and popped, its warmth a small comfort against the cold desert night. The survivors, once fearful and lost, had found something else, a sense of community, a sense of family, even if it was formed from the wreckage of their past lives. The moon hung high in the sky, its silver light casting a quiet glow over the land. Sofia felt something stirring within her, a sense of peace she hadn't felt in so long. The road ahead would be long, and there would be more battles to fight, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of what might come. She had already faced the darkness, and she had come out the other side. With Max at her side, and the small group of survivors by her, Sofia was ready to face whatever came next. Together, they would rebuild. The morning sun was already rising, casting the desert in a warm, golden light. Sofia woke with the first rays of dawn, her body stiff from the long journey, but her spirit somehow lighter than it had been in days. The cool desert air had a certain clarity to it, the kind that made everything feel a little more possible, a little more hopeful. The hard part was done. The cartel was gone, and now the future lay ahead. Max was already awake, his golden eyes alert as he stood on the outskirts of the camp, his body poised and ready, as though he were watching for any signs of danger. But Sofia knew it wasn't just instinct keeping him vigilant, it was the bond between them. Max had been with her through every step of the struggle, through every trial, every fear. He was more than just a dog. He was her family. Sofia stood up slowly, stretching the tightness out of her muscles, and walked over to where Maria was stirring the small fire that had burned out during the night. The woman's face was tired, but there was a sense of calm that hadn't been there before. The rest of the group was still asleep, huddled in their blankets, their faces soft in sleep. "It's going to be a long road ahead," Maria said, breaking the silence as she glanced up at Sofia. "But it's worth it. We're going to make it, right?" Sofia nodded, though her thoughts were still scattered, weighing the challenges ahead. "We will," she said, her voice steady. "We have to." Maria gave a small smile, though it was tinged with sadness. "We've all lost so much, but now we have something. A chance to rebuild. A chance to find peace." Sofia couldn't help but agree. It had been so long since she had allowed herself to even think of peace. But now, with the cartel gone and the mountains in the distance, peace didn't feel so impossible. Maria stood up and stretched. "I'll gather everyone. It's time to move again. The settlement's not far from here. We should reach it by sundown if we keep a good pace." Sofia nodded, then looked down at Max. The dog had turned his attention toward the horizon, his stance relaxed but alert. Sofia knew they couldn't linger too long. The journey was far from over. But this time, they weren't running. They were building something new. They were taking control of their futures, and for the first time in a long while, Sofia felt the weight of the world on her shoulders, but not as a burden. She felt it as a challenge, one she was ready to face. By midday, the group was moving again, winding their way up the narrow path that led to the higher foothills. Max moved easily at Sofia's side, never faltering, his eyes scanning the desert around them, always watching for any signs of danger. But this time, it felt different. There were no cartel soldiers to fear, no gunfire on the horizon. They were free. The journey was slower than Sofia would have liked, but she understood the pace. Each person in the group carried something with them, some weighed down by grief, others by the pain of their pasts. But all of them carried hope now, and that was a start, a new beginning. By the time the sun began to set, casting the world in shades of deep orange and purple, they reached the settlement, a small, almost hidden enclave tucked into the folds of the mountains, surrounded by natural barriers. It wasn't much, but it didn't need to be. It was a place where people could heal, where they could begin to rebuild their lives. The settlement was small, with makeshift shelters lined up in neat rows, and a central area where fires burned, warming the gathered people. Most of them looked weary, but there was a quiet strength about them. These were the survivors, the people who had escaped the cartel's reign and found a place to rest, to heal. Sofia and Max were greeted with cautious optimism. The people here had heard of the young woman who had brought down the cartel, but they had never expected to meet her face to face. There was no fanfare, no celebrations, just people who had lived through a nightmare, now ready to start over. Sofia and Maria spoke with the settlement leaders, sharing their story and their plans. There was an immediate sense of solidarity, an unspoken agreement that this was a place for healing, not just for physical wounds, but for the emotional scars that the cartel had left behind. As night fell and the settlement came to life around them, Sofia stood at the edge of the campfire, her eyes searching the faces around her. The people here were so much like her, lost, but now, slowly finding their way. For the first time in a long time, Sofia allowed herself to let go of the tension that had built up in her body. She wasn't alone anymore. She was part of something. She had helped create this moment. Max was at her side, his fur catching the firelight as he lay beside her, content and still. Sofia could feel the bond between them, unspoken, unbreakable. For so long, she had felt like an outsider. For so long, she had fought for survival without ever knowing if she would make it through. But now, standing here, watching the survivors gather around the fire, Sofia knew something she hadn't known before. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, and she was going to help others do the same. It was a new beginning, not just for her, but for everyone here. The cartel might have torn their lives apart, but it hadn't won. They had survived. And now, together, they would rebuild. Sofia stood tall, her eyes lifting toward the stars above, the same stars that had watched over her through all the darkness. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. Max stood with her, his head held high, the faithful companion who had seen her through every battle. Together, they had fought for their lives, for their freedom, and now, together, they would fight for something greater: peace, and the promise of a future free from fear. The night sky above the settlement stretched endlessly, a blanket of stars that seemed to shine brighter than Sofia had ever remembered. The desert air was cool now, the heat of the day replaced with a crispness that made it feel like the world was holding its breath. Sofia stood by the campfire, Max beside her, both of them looking out at the small group of survivors gathered around. Their faces were tired but hopeful, their eyes filled with the same quiet resolve that Sofia had seen in herself since the fight began. It had been days since they had made their way up the mountain, since they had crossed the threshold into this new place. The journey had been long, but it had been worth it. The settlement was small, its people humble, but there was something about it that made Sofia feel like she had finally found a place to belong. There was no running, no hiding, just living, and that was enough. Sofia glanced down at Max, who was lying at her feet, his eyes closed, but his senses still sharp. He was the protector, the companion who had been with her through everything, and he had seen the change, the transformation that had taken place in her. For so long, Sofia had been consumed by anger, by fear. She had let the weight of her father's death, of the cartel's cruelty, define her. But now, as she looked around at the faces of the survivors, she realized how much she had changed. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a leader. Maria came up to her, sitting down beside Sofia with a tired but contented sigh. The firelight flickered across her face, casting shadows that only seemed to highlight the strength in her features. Maria had been through so much, losing her family, running from the cartel, but now she was a symbol of the hope that Sofia had longed for. "We've come a long way," Maria said quietly, her eyes still watching the fire. "And there's more to do. But I think we're finally on the right path." Sofia nodded, her gaze distant. "We are. It's strange, though. I thought this would feel different, you know? I thought that when we brought down the cartel, it would be this big moment, this huge victory. But it doesn't feel like that. It feels like the start of something new. And I guess I didn't know what that would feel like." Maria smiled, the lines of worry around her eyes softening for a moment. "That's because it is. This is just the beginning. The people here are rebuilding, Sofia. You've given us the chance to start fresh, not just for us, but for those who are still out there, still fighting. We have a chance to show them that there's something worth fighting for." Sofia looked out at the group of survivors gathered around the fire. They were talking quietly now, sharing stories, planning for what came next. They were beginning to heal, little by little, and Sofia could feel the change in the air. It wasn't the loud kind of victory. It wasn't about the cartel's collapse. It was something quieter, something deeper. It was about the possibility of life without fear. She had come so far. From the little girl terrified of the cartel to the woman standing here now, with the strength to lead. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. And for the first time, Sofia felt a sense of peace she hadn't known she could ever have again. Max stirred beside her, and she reached down to scratch behind his ears, a small smile on her face. He was always there when she needed him, always ready to move forward. "We've still got work to do," Sofia murmured to him, her voice filled with quiet determination. Max responded with a low whine, as if to say, "Always." The night continued on, the crackle of the fire the only sound in the quiet desert air. Sofia's thoughts drifted, and she wondered about the road ahead. She had promised herself that she would do whatever it took to make the world a better place. And she had seen the first steps of that change. The people here in the settlement were survivors, and they would continue to fight, to rebuild. There were still remnants of the cartel to dismantle, and there were still battles to be fought. But for now, Sofia allowed herself to believe that the worst was behind them. The darkness that had consumed her life for so long had been pushed back, and the light of hope was starting to fill the space that had once been so empty. And as the night wore on, Sofia couldn't help but feel that, just maybe, the future wasn't as uncertain as it had seemed. The world was no longer a place of shadows and fear. It was a place where she and Max could carve out a life of peace, where they could finally find rest. As the stars above blinked down on her, Sofia felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. The cartel had been defeated, but the journey wasn't over. There would always be more to do, more to rebuild, more lives to touch. But Sofia was ready. She had already faced the darkness, and now she was ready to embrace the light. Max, sensing her thoughts, stood up and walked over to where she sat, his eyes soft and understanding. He nudged her gently, and Sofia smiled, her hand reaching out to rest on his strong back. Together, they had taken on the world. Together, they would see it through. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow for another special story.